Ah, Valentine's, the time of year when couples stress about proving their love to their significant others and singles either celebrate or lament the fact that they won't have to. Capturing the sounds of romance in anime, or really in any musical setting, can be a lot trickier than it seems. There are obvious tropes and tricks to making it happen, such as the heavy use of strings, particularly violins, but finding the right balance between drama, emotion, and just the right amount of cheese isn't always the most clear-cut path to navigate in a world so saturated with romantic stories. And I am an absolute sucker for shoujo manga and anime, which typically focus on romantic storylines and subplots. So when the soundtracks are able to match the pacing and emotions hidden within the overthinking heroines and they're burdened by the scars of their past male counterparts, I eat it all up without hesitation. So let's take a look and listen to how some of my favorite romance anime soundtracks handle the task and see if we can figure out the key to unlocking the sounds of love. When it comes to romantic music, fantasy and modern settings both have their own unique set of tropes, pitfalls, and strengths, as well as many that they share. One of the more obvious ways to write romantic music in a fantasy show is simply to utilize the usual romance trope of strings and woodwinds while making sure to leave out non-orchestral instruments. This even works well enough in modern settings, though modern stories have the advantage of utilizing electric and electronic instruments without seeming out of place.
It's a tender ray, あなたのもとへ
First up, we have Soredemo, Sekai wa Utsukushii, The World is Still Beautiful, with its fittingly beautiful soundtrack by Yamashita Kosuke, who most people will recognize as the composer for Chihayafuru. Aside from the questionable J-pop ballad sung by Nikke in order to summon rain, the soundtrack is very standard fare as far as romance fantasy is concerned, which in no way means it is bad, but it will help us to recognize what that means when the modern and second fantasy shows we'll discuss respectively subvert and double down on it. This is the main overture track that sets up the atmosphere of the show. Nikke is the youngest princess of the Rain Dukedom, suddenly finding herself being married off to the Child King Livius of the Sun Kingdom. The opening with the horns introduces a sort of grandiose setting, beginning with an immediate octave jump in the melody that descends into another octave jump up. It evokes the sound of awakening at dawn, matching the new path in Nikke's life as the trumpets and snares march in, leading into a string run-up into a grand melody to represent the majestic new life she'll be thrust into as the queen of the most powerful person in the world. The strings taking over the melody is the first sign that this will in fact be a romance. However, this on its own isn't necessarily enough to prove it. Rather, we are merely being given a taste of what the story will have to offer through the main theme's melody. This quickly settles into a mellow section led by a tin whistle and harpsichord in E-flat Lydian, adding a bit of drama to our otherwise hopeful-sounding opening, Lydian being the brightest of all the modes. The harpsichord obviously represents the Victorian-esque royal life that Nikke has become entangled in, while the tin whistle acts as a representation of how she will navigate through it, having come from a much more humble and culturally different kingdom. Again, the strings take over the melody, albeit much more subdued this time, hinting at Nikke's changing feelings towards the man she must call her husband as they push the melody into a rising figure. This then gets traded off to the clarinet and oboe playing in unison, rising up over the marching rhythm in the snares, much like how Nikke and Livy must navigate their new relationship amidst the political and personal conflicts occurring in the background. The trumpet and strings take over, perhaps as a sign that Livy, being the powerful yet misunderstood king that he is, will help lead her along. And while Nikke might not believe that he is as mentally stable as he tries to come across, her feelings for him will help give him a supporting shove from behind, as represented in the strings running alongside the trumpet's melody line. There's one more moment to breathe as the oboe takes over the melody in a brief calm section once again. For all of his pomp and grandeur, Livy will eventually need to rely on someone when he cannot keep up his front. And who else will be there in his hour of need but Nike, comforting, caring, and mentally prepared to face the trials that may come about. And once he's back on his feet, the two can continue pressing forward, and the orchestra swells back into the main motif once again, placing heavy, if not cliched, emphasis on the church-like bell chimes to signify their feelings and ability to overcome difficulties by supporting one another in matrimony. It's all somewhat cliche, but in that sense it's also all very well composed, as the tropes of a cliche idea, while perhaps tried and tired, are only considered as such due to the fact that they are proven to work, and it is only our own overexposure to these tropes that makes them start to sound cheesy in the first place. The main melody, making use of octave leaps, is a surefire way to catch the listener's attention while also hinting at the grand scale on which the story will take place. Quickly switching between grandiose and calm sections in new keys creates a large contrast through which we can assume that there will be moments of tenderness, and the fact that it never delves into darker, more dramatic harmonies does not mean that we will never experience drama within the story, but rather that we know that, above all else, the love shared between our protagonists will allow them to overcome the obstacles in their paths. Here we have something that sounds strikingly different, and yet not for the most obvious of reasons. Aoharaido, Blue Spring Ride, is a high school shoujo romance story centered around Futaba and Ko and the circumstances that led them to meet again after Ko suddenly moved away in middle school. Now reunited, he is only a mere shadow of his former self, no longer the playful little boy Futaba had feelings for, but now a gloomy young man that hardly resembles whom he once was. The choice to open the main theme with the piano plays on the idea of nostalgia, as this is a defining feature of the piano in film scores. This works in two ways, as it represents Futaba and Ko's relationship from when they were younger, as well as the audience's nostalgia for a time when we were younger and more willing to put our hearts and feelings out there. It may seem like I'm stretching that reasoning, but the title of the series is basically a play on words that takes the kanji characters for youth, seishun, and reads them separately, ao and haru, meaning blue and spring. It literally translates to youth ride, as in a journey through one's youthful days. Also, unlike the previous example, this theme doesn't open with an octave leap, and for that matter, it doesn't even include any octave leaps at all. The simplest answer is that it isn't trying to be grandiose, at least not in the same way that the other one obviously was. This is a high school romance, something most of us can relate to on at least some level, and the feelings are much more subdued and real than the majestic romance of a king and queen in a fictional kingdom of magical J-pop rain ballads. There's a bit of playful teasing with the strings, but instead of singing out lush melodies to proclaim the protagonist's love for one another, these ones pluck rhythmic melodies. It sounds like a rapid heartbeat or like butterflies fluttering around in your stomach, nervously pushing the piano melody along. And within the first minute, we also have our first hint that this is more than likely not a fantasy story. Though quietly supporting the harmony and rhythm, an electric guitar strums under the main melody, slowly building as an acoustic guitar, drums, and shakers accompany the mix of strings and woodwinds. It never quite becomes band-like music, but the inclusion of these band instruments turns the classic romantic sound of the ensemble into a modern romance. I mentioned jokingly in my Space Brothers analysis that the electric guitar was added into one rendition of the theme to keep it hip with the kids, but honestly in this case this is the exact reason this one resonates with a more realistic depiction of modern romance than the orchestral swells of fantasy romances. One thing to keep in mind with this track is that despite the presence of strings and woodwinds, it somehow still doesn't sound fantasy-esque, and this is primarily due to the presence of these instruments in pop music. Strings are easy enough to find in pretty much any situation, and the woodwinds are simply replacing what would usually be a vocal line in this case. And given that the romance is the central theme, the lack of brass gives it that perfectly ballad-esque sound. Sure, brass has its place in pop music as well, but in the context of thematic material, it lends itself much better to comedies or faster-paced material. The climax of the theme allows the band to overtake the rest of the ensemble while still leaving the strings to play out the melody. It's then bookended by a calm closing piano section, which not only serves as a fitting conclusion music-wise, but as a thematic piece as well. We can't be certain that any of the heartbeats or flutters going on in the music we just heard are from characters actually taking initiative or merely realizing their feelings, and thus it ends calmly but without exactly answering any of the questions we may have had, leaving us to ponder what the future of their relationships might be while still being satisfied with the steps they're taking forward. On the flip side of the main theme, which serves as a comprehensive package to encapsulate the themes of the series as a whole, the track playing now is for the specifically tender moments between characters, usually when they're discussing something that makes or used to make them feel uneasy. The use of rubato in the melody line adds some drama to represent the should I, shouldn't I feelings that keep our characters rocking on their heels. Keeping both the melody and harmony lines high gives an airiness to it, like the tense character in question is holding their breath before the tension releases and the main melody kicks in at a lower register. It's worth noting that the melody itself never really plays the octave, often rising up to the 7th and occasionally the 9th, both of which sound fine but lack the stability of having the same note playing at different registers. Even on the rare occasions that it does, the supporting harmony is either unresolved or playing in 7ths itself, and these unstable intervals add even more insecurity to the feelings of the characters. The longer the track goes on, the more the range of pitches increases, adding complexity to the music while keeping the same basic melody and harmonies to show that, while things may be difficult for Futaba, Ko, or any of the others at the given moment, they've resolved to face their insecurities head on, in turn adding depth to their characters with the deepening of the music. These feelings are further emphasized in the string orchestra version, though with the additional layer being that Futaba and Ko are not only going to face their feelings or problems, but that they will overcome them, making sure to lay themselves bare so that they can live without regrets. Though the piano did also swell into a more powerful section, its dynamic range can't really compete with the depth and texture of a full string section. Somehow the unstable intervals in the melody and harmony are able to sound more fleshed out and rich despite being the same as the piano solos. And here we've landed in the opposite realm of Aoharaido to another fantasy romance with a soundtrack by one of my favorite composers, Oshima Michiru. Akagami no Shirayukihime, Snow White with the Red Hair, is one of the best shoujo anime I've ever seen, with extremely well-written characters, a simple but well-executed plot, and of course fantastic music. Shirayuki is a common apothecary in the kingdom of Tambaroon who strikes the fancy of the first Prince Raj because of her unique red hair. Informed without warning that she is to become his concubine, Shirayuki runs away, where she is rescued from her pursuers by Zen, the second prince of neighboring kingdom Clarinus. From there, she works to become a court herbalist in the Clarinus royal palace, while she and Zen balance the classic difficulties of romance between a commoner and prince. There really isn't anything particularly unique about the story aside from Shirayuki wanting to be an herbalist, but this simplicity is why every aspect is able to have so much detail. From the moment the flute enters with the octave leap on D and the strings and harp support it from below, it's immediately apparent what kind of story this is going to be. This melody screams romance in every possible aspect, and the flute represents Shirayuki herself, much like how a heroic action story would likely represent its main character with a trumpet or horn. Common of Oshima's compositions, the melody features a bit of chromaticism to lengthen passages and make the resolutions to the expected notes feel much more relieving, while the chromatic steps themselves feel playful rather than clashing. For example, in the first few bars, we have the first chromatic step in a rising figure from A sharp to B before jumping up to the F sharp. This then leads into a stepwise phrase going E, D, C sharp, D, and then steps up diatonically, keeping the chromatic step on the lower two notes for F sharp E, D sharp E, and this whole figure makes the resolution up to A feel extremely cathartic, despite the fact that it isn't even our home key. Most iterations of the theme have some kind of light, fluttery counter-melody or effect in the woodwinds reminiscent of birdsong. Shirayuki, whose name literally translates to Snow White, doesn't initially have any particularly special affinity with animals, but these bird-like melodies are obviously a reference to Disney's Snow White and the trope of princesses befriending woodland creatures. Of course, this becomes more relevant to the story after Shirayuki actually becomes involved with Kihal and the birds of Yuri Island, but regardless of that, it's still a nice touch that helps lift the music up into the realms of joyful romance. This piece serves as both the show's main theme as well as Shirayuki's character theme, and is probably the most blatantly romantic for obvious reasons. No matter which iteration we hear, it is always romantic in nature and reflects the context that Shirayuki has been placed in. For example, in the version that plays when she sets out to escape from Tambaroon, the melody begins with the strings. However, the opening leitmotif is immediately altered, with the usual step down to F sharp being replaced with a step back up to D. These first few repetitions of this altered melody are actually the only relation this track has to the original, replacing the swingy string melody from before with a darker, more dramatic section that rises into a hopeful cadence right before transitioning into the B section. The new B section sees a solo horn taking on a new melody while strings supported in the harmony. This horn is a play on the idea of adventure, with our heroine setting out on a journey despite the fact that this isn't necessarily the show you might expect such a solo to exist in. It is quickly overtaken by romantic strings playing dramatically, shifting between unsettling minor chords and uplifting major chords before settling on a weirdly cathartic yet unresolved C major right at the end. While the main idea is of Shirayuki traveling and her mindset as she leaves the place she once called home, the sense of romance is never lost thanks to the strong presence of the strings and harp. Even the horn, arguably the least abrasive of the brass instruments, conveys a sense of softness that blends well with the strings. And while the iteration itself isn't blaringly romantic by comparison, out of context this track sounds very much like a tragically romantic overture. This show actually has two recurring main themes, with the first being the Shirayuki tracks and the others titled Dei, the Encounter. The encounters are used to represent the romance that blossoms between Shirayuki and Zen, and so it's a bit unexpected that the first iteration doesn't sound particularly romantic. If anything, it sounds reminiscent due to the track being a slow piano solo with a Moonlight Sonata style pattern in the left hand, while the right hand lightly taps away a simple melody. Looking at it in retrospect from the end of the show, this nostalgia makes sense, but it serves a different purpose in the beginning. That being that this is the piece in its most basic form, and it will evolve with each subsequent iteration. To briefly cover how each version of the encounter changes, the second version begins much like the first, with the simple walking left-hand piano line, but this time the melody is played by the flute, and later by a string trio. The piano remains a constant throughout, however, tying the track to the original with only the addition of a few extra instruments. The third iteration replaces the piano with a harp, upping the romantic sounds while the melody and harmony are handled by the full string section and woodwind quintet. The fourth gets right into it, with the violins taking the melody while the harp plucks at half speed in the background. The double basses really come in here to add an extra layer of depth, while a pair of flutes take the melody at a much higher register. And then the official final version opens with the orchestra's concertmaster ripping out a killer solo on his violin while the orchestra swells underneath. Oddly enough, the whole opening section only vaguely resembles the other versions of the encounter before the B section kicks in with Shirayuki's theme. Strange as it sounds in theory, this makes total sense as this piece has been building and building each time we hear it to the point where it can't really build anymore. And so the violin solo playing over the harmonies of the encounter transitioning into the most romantic piece in the entire soundtrack is quite apt. This is also quite cleverly mirrored in the final iteration of Shirayuki's theme, where the closing section is not the usual wind down with the string section, but instead another solo on the violin to bring it all home. In that sense, we could argue that the true final version of the encounter is actually the final version of Shirayuki, as they merge together as one piece in the official final version. And as a final offhand remark about how much Akagami no Shirayukihime doubled down on the romance factor for its OST, as if the string-heavy tracks weren't already indicative enough, the whole soundtrack was recorded with, excuse my awful pronunciation, Orchestra de l'Opéra Nationale de Paris, the National Opera Orchestra of Paris. If you're going to record a soundtrack that oozes the sense of love, what better way than to shell out to hire an entire orchestra from the city of love itself? Whether you're out there loving love or you'd rather live it vicariously through anime characters, there's no shortage of shows that'll get those butterflies fluttering. And like any show or movie, the way the music portrays the environment of the show will completely change the way these feelings of love translate to the audience. There are loads of other anime that I could talk about that handle these things in different ways, but this video's already long enough. So don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and consider supporting me over on Patreon if you feel so inclined. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.